Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. In today's episode, we're going to explore the intersection of traditional knowledge, science, and policy. We have always wondered, right? Things like turmeric, which are both a food, but a food with medicinal properties. How do they get regulated? Who regulates them? India has a vast heritage of traditional medicine and nutritional diversity, which means that there are many plants which serve both as food and as medicine. So, how do we go about defining medicinal foods? Who regulates them in India and globally? How do we get information on them in appropriate channels? To discuss insights from recent collaborative research, shedding light on how standardized plant nomenclature might impact regulation, public health, and welfare programs, we have with us today Megha and Varun from the University of Transdisciplinary Health and Bob Allkin from the Royal Botanic Gardens. So, let's deep dive into more about traditional medicine. We'll start with you, Megha. What are medicinal foods?
It's a interesting category because if you look at it in a regulator's playbook or if you look at it in a nutritionist's playbook, it doesn't exist as a legal category. It certainly exists as a category that you and I are familiar with. In fact, there's a journal dedicated to medicinal foods. But the what we would call scientific definition for such ingredients is not well established. We consider any food that has been eaten by humans as a food, but which also has medicinal properties to be medicinal food. And that's a very, very broad category.
So, who regulates them?
And this is where, this category definition becomes very important. So let's talk about turmeric, right? Turmeric you will consider as a medicinal food because it is so well researched in terms of its medicinal properties, its indigenous knowledge system, and it is a indispensable spice in the Indian cuisine, right? So in India, you will find the mention for turmeric not just in the Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia, which is regulated by the Ayush Ministry, but you will also find it in the Indian food composition table, which is a compilation of ingredients and their nutritive values published by the National Institute of Nutrition, and that is regulated by the Indian Council for Medical Research. So you have one ingredient, but it is regulated both medicinally as well as from an indigenous knowledge system, as well as nutritionally from two very different organizations, depending on the use of this particular product. So one aspect I think we must remember, and this comes about when you look at food versus medicine, is that the dosage that you would typically use for a medicine is very different from the dosage that you would use it as a food. We did a back of the envelope calculation, and if somebody were to eat about half a cup of dal, the amount of curcumin, which is the bioactive molecule with a lot of evidence from turmeric, is 0.5 milligrams, whereas what you would see in a scientific study would be anywhere from 200 to 500 milligrams, and that's a big change in consumption. But that big change can have impacts on usage.
Sure, and I think stuff like turmeric also can be toxic in certain amounts. And just calling it medicinal at times for something that is so commonly found in the kitchen, we might need to be a bit more cautious about it. Mega, just on the turmeric. So we spoke about traditional medicine, which talk about as food, but is also now a component in form of tablets, etc. Because curcumin has been now shown to have medicinal properties. So does the third regulator need to get involved when something comes up in the form of tablets for? Yeah.
Absolutely. So in India, we have the CDSCO, which is the Central Drug Regulatory Agency, that has to come into play. And both in terms of the quality and in terms of the amount that is being used. But here is where a problem emerges that FSSAI, which regulates what can go into a food, it allows for the use of turmeric in foods. It certainly will tell you how much of turmeric, up to what percentage you can use as well. But in reality, because of the regulatory landscape, and it is quite poor in terms of quality checks and so forth, the amount of turmeric can be even higher. And when it is given as a drug, because it is accepted in the Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia, it can be easily included in a food which claims its medicinal properties, but at a dosage that is very different from what you and I can consume as an everyday food. So there is a lot of ambiguity because information from many sources are being combined, and there is no one regulatory agency that is looking at this turmeric.
Sure. And then we can add the WhatsApp University to this list, which will give its own yarn on what is good about turmeric, I guess. But just coming back to your study now, I'm curious, how did the study evolve? What is the role, say, the Q plays into this? Bob, would you like to talk us through that?
Sure. So Kew is a large botanical research institution, more than 500 scientists, up to more than 100 PhD students from many countries. But it's been around a long time, and because of that, for decades and decades, since Darwin's time, Kew has been the sort of the centre of documenting scientific nomenclature and plant taxonomy. And so as a result, we've built up these reference sources that curated by Q staff, but also from others working around the world, and taxonomic experts from around the world contribute their views as to what is the current taxonomy of plants. And so just to give you a flavour, there are something like 1.5 million scientific names that have ever been published, and that's in one database that Q manage. But there are maybe 340,000 different plants. And so there are at least 4 scientific names for every plant. And the questions are, which are the right ones to use, and are they really the same? And what does the new DNA evidence tell us about whether or not these 2 plants should be in the same genus or not? So that very fundamental botanical referencing work is done at Kew. And those data sets are extremely widely used by the botanical research community globally. So international agencies and World Floras Online and the Encyclopedia of Life, all these different data sets use Q's data for that purpose. But those data are also important for people working in other disciplines, and that includes health professionals or those that work with timber or agriculturalists. And these professions, it's been long my view, that just don't know about Q's resources and don't know how to use them. And that's because they've been devised mostly in language in a way that suit botanists, but don't suit health professionals, for example. And so the Medicinal Plant Name Service was a project that we began 12 years ago now, and we were working with initially with the European and UK regulators who had problems handling the safety and efficacy, particularly of Chinese traditional medicines that are very widely being sold in England, and there were problems around toxicity precisely. How did they get hold of this? And then they discovered that the same plant compound was being described in different countries in different ways with different names. And then the regulators could not share that information. And so our purpose was to try and catalogue herbal medicines and the alternative names that are used for the plants, the common names, the trade names, and the scientific names, but also the names that are used for those drugs and for those herbal substances. So we've now, last November, we published version 14, and we're now aware of 39,000 different medicinal plants being used around the world in all sorts of different cultures, most of them traditionally, but some are more commercially, obviously adopted. And we will capture names such as ginseng, which we can point to the fact that it is now referring to drugs derived from 20 different plants with different chemistries and purposes. Or the pharmacists love to use Latin names that look a bit like Latin scientific botanical names. So Sisamafuga rhizome, for example, is a pharmaceutical name. It appears in the Japanese, the Chinese, the European, and the US pharmacopoeias as a formal definition, but it actually means a completely different drug in those different pharmacopoeias. And so when you see the name Sisamafuga rhizome, apparently written in Latin and looking rather posh, actually it's ambiguous. We don't know which one of those drugs you were taking. So that's our role, and we've been exposing that ambiguity, and we work with US Food and Drug Administration, WHO, and others. We were very, very pleased to make contact with TDU University in Bengaluru. It must be at least 5 years we've been collaborating now on a series of projects. The value to us was that TDU had this vast archive and knowledge about the plants that are being used in Ayurvedic medicine. And that led us to be able to incorporate the different names that are used in India in different languages and different parts of India, and to map that into the records that we would hold from Sri Lanka or Pakistan. And we can point out which plants are being used in traditional Chinese medicines, but also in Ayurvedic medicine, for example. So it's been a really healthy and rewarding collaboration that we've had. One of the challenges that we realized is that the Western doctors, the regulators and the GPs that work in the UK, when they talk about a medicine, they have a very narrow view of something which you take when you've got a health problem. It is to fix a disease or a health condition. Whereas in Ayurvedic medicine, there is this broader sense of a medicine actually being around well-being. It's much more holistic. It's much more about, and this includes so many of those drugs that are described in the Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia are primarily around nutrition, or have a role in nutrition and in avoiding disease, and rather than dealing with it. And that fundamental distinction between treating a disease and avoiding it through nutrition is something which is fascinating, and it has led us to realize that we can't just deal with medicines. And indeed, in the UK, Megha was talking about the problems of how regulators deal with this. They have a medicines agency that deals with regulating medicines, and they have a food regulator that deals with it. And then they've got these products that they call border products. And these are sort of part food, part medicine. They really can't work out what they are, and they fight over them. And they have a committee which joins these two different agencies to come together and try and decide what they're going to do with them. So we created a new project, which is now relatively new, Plants for Health, which is expanding the scope of what we do in this avoidance of ambiguity in the terminology, but to health products generally. So we would be including food supplements and the toxicity elements and so forth. So that's what we've been doing, and yeah, grateful to be working with TDU.
Hey, this is great. I mean, a few years ago, I was in Brazil as part of one of the India representatives for the BRICS Academic Forum. And obviously, Brazil has a traditional medicine system. The Chinese have a traditional medicine system, and India has a traditional medicine system. So we were trying to see whether we could get through the BRICS to kind of lead some sort of effort to kind of see whether there are synergies across these three systems and see whether we can actually harmonize. There's also a lot of pushback against Ayurveda in India from certain quarters about whether it's tested enough, whether it's still relevant, etc. And this was To see similar kind of medical approaches being taken across various countries was kind of reaffirming that, hey, maybe there's something there, yes, should be tested, but we cannot just negate it because there is, without testing it. And we ran into this problem that different cultures would call the same plants differently.
Yes.
And so the language became a really big barrier on how we could start establishing something
Yes.
that would go forward. So I think this kind of effort will be of huge help in kind of just trying to understand these
So I worked previously for the Department for International Development in a rural development project in northeastern Brazil. And medicinal plants were fundamental to those rural communities. They couldn't afford the bus ride to go get to the pharmacy to buy aspirin, let alone actually be able to buy aspirin. So they depend 100% on traditional medicines. And just as you're describing, the local names for a plant would vary from one state to the next, even in northeastern Brazil. And that meant that some nuns were giving out medicinal plants to rural communities that were poisonous because they were giving the wrong plant. It just happened to share the same common name as a medicinal plant from another state that had been written up in a book. And so they assumed that they could give those plants out. So these names are happen at a local level as well as internationally, as you describe.
Yeah. Thanks, Papa. And this is a nice segue to my next question. Varun, in India, so many languages, so much diversity in cuisine. Do we have a repository of medicinal plants? Is there an authentic source that we can go to and say, hey, what is it that I'm eating?
So there are a lot of resources on the internet, but I'm not aware of a portal that has curated authentic data that is comprehensive across traditional systems and modern health systems. People generally use the Pharmacopoeia and the Formulary of India published by the Government of India for medicinal plant reference. And for food plants, we have a document published by the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, FSSAI, on nutraceuticals. This serves as a guiding document. And also we have a document that has very useful information published by the National Institution of India for Nutrition that has very good information on the food composition. But unfortunately, the plant nomenclature, the scientific names of plants in all of these documents is outdated. And they do little justice when it comes to the complexity of nomenclature that exists in the traditional health systems also. That is one of the challenges we have.
Great. So I guess the question to all of you and whoever wants to answer, what do you think was the major outcomes of your project that are relevant to this discussion? Bob, do you want to?
Well, I'm obsessed with names, but I really do think, however arcane and boring it is, the fact that regulators, be they in India or elsewhere, are unaware of how to use scientific plant nomenclature reliably, appropriately, unambiguously, and not misleadingly, is a real challenge to science, to health generally. And so what I would say that we have discovered is that having looked at food plants in India and medicinal plants in India and different governmental sources of information, you can see that the same plant is being called different things by different people. You can see that a significant percentage of the data records that are being presented around food composition or around medicinal use are actually ambiguous. You can't be sure which plant, which product is being used by the consumer. And so I think you alluded to some resistance to the use of Ayurvedic medicine, for example, even within India. And of course, Western science has got this very strong argument that they need evidence of the value of the efficacy of these medicinal drugs and so forth. And that and at some level that is true. I am a scientist. I work for a scientific institution. We're interested in scientific evidence and credibility. Nevertheless, if you take what I tell my students is, if I'm drinking a cup of chamomile tea at night, then I'm drinking a soup of lots and lots and lots of different molecules simultaneously. We, as scientists, probably don't know what a very significant percentage of those molecules are, and we probably don't understand yet enough about the body to understand how those molecules might be interacting with different body systems, less other than the really well-known ones. And maybe those molecules are interacting one with another at the same time. So my point being that scientific evidence is lacking, but actually science isn't good enough yet to obtain the evidence that is there. And so I think that is a real challenge, and it means that the regulators at least in Europe and the US, have tended to dismiss traditional medicines, plant-based medicines, treat them as inferior. And that means that I can go into a shop in London and buy natural products, which are nothing more than cardboard, or they've certainly got the wrong plant in them, because there is much less regulatory control than there is over aspirin and so forth. And I think that does a disservice to the consumer and their
Yeah, I
health.
agree. Yeah. Megha, you want?
I wanted to add to what Bob is alluding to with an example. Amla, or Indian gooseberry, which is so popular in our food system as well as in our traditional knowledge system. When I started working on it, realized there are two scientific names that I'm finding publications in, Phyllanthus umbilicus and then Umbilicus officinalis. So that means if I want to even look at the scientific literature around this plant, I would have to know that there were, two names that existed. One of them is more recent than the other. But even for me to sort of scour and do a literature survey, I need this information. And there is little oversight in our usage of this nomenclature. I know about it because I belong to TDU, and this is something we have been doing, and I work on this project. But for example, and maybe Varun can talk about the nomenclature of food items in the NIN database and the scientific names there.
Yeah, so unfortunately, this is a case across all repositories that you find on the internet and all documents published. In the case of Institute of Nutrition, NIN, we found that the scientific names published lack the author names. And unfortunately, that is not enough to identify a plant unambiguously, right? So we don't know which plant is that. We have very useful information about all the parameters that are very relevant, but we don't have, in some cases, the name is ambiguous. We can't identify which plant it is.
Wow, I'm just stunned that, I mean, we're looking at something that in traditional knowledge is quite old, and the fact that the word ambiguous has come from all three of you so many times. It's just studying that for the system that that old, we have not been able to figure out a good way to harmonize going ahead. And I guess it just also speaks to its widespread use, right? I mean, because it is old, it must have a nice phylogenetic tree of various people discovering and naming it different things, and then culturally picking up from each other. Yeah.
One of the very interesting projects that we've run together with TDU was to look at medicinal plants from India that are housed in an economic botany collection at Kew, and that were collected in India during the early colonial period by the physicians that came from Europe to work in India. And they were learning from the health practitioners in India. They were walking in the marketplace, seeing new plants to them and collecting them. And of course, back in Europe at that stage, they were still using plants as a source of their medicines. They weren't using sophisticated pharmaceutical products. They were still using plants. And so they would take the plants back. And some of those plants ended up becoming modern drugs, but others fell by the wayside or were forgotten about. So we have that collection at Kew, and it was a project funded by the British Academy and a collaboration between TDU and ourselves. We were able to digitize that collection so that the images all are now available to TDU for exposing on the website and so forth. And TDU colleagues unlike botanists at Kew, the TDU botanists were able to recognize these dried roots or fragments of a leaf that were being used at that time and were being stored as medicinal products, and recognize what they were today. And so we were able to track to a degree the extent to which the names for these plants and the names for these Ayurvedic medicines changed over time, but also which plants were being used in an Ayurvedic product. So it's not necessarily the case that a particular drug with an Ayurvedic name in the Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia has always been exactly the same. There has been evolution and change. And so over time, you get an additional source of ambiguity, to come back to that word again.
Okay. Okay. So I guess you have now laid out a very nice landscape of, what are the challenges? What are your key takeaways? I mean, where do we go from here in terms of regulation, in terms of delivering outcomes? Megha?
All right. I will address the regulation aspect of it and ask Bob to summarize the other results that we got. What we observed from a policy point of view is that and this reflects culture, right? I mean, how the regulatory landscape itself has developed. Clearly, when in the early 19th century, when medicines were being manufactured and distributed, like a sophisticated regulatory landscape developed. That's why you have the FDA, or you have the Indian regulators and so forth. So here, what they did was they had a single molecule, and then they were able to track that single molecule or single product, vaccines and so forth, and have a very complex, rigorous assessment of how to make sure that consumers were safeguarded before something got released to them, right? Um, Unfortunately, indigenous medicine doesn't work in the same way, because we don't have standardized products, we don't have standardized processes of manufacture. In India, for example, the texts that talk about these medicines don't necessarily tell you the exact proportion in which to use them. They would say that you put one part of this and one part of that and combine it, just to be superficial, but that it is not put down in the way that you and I would consider a protocol, right? A scientific protocol. So clearly, this is something that regulators have to recognize and understand, that the framework they have derived for single molecule studies, efficacy, consumer safety, etc., may not be applicable in the same way to a indigenous medicine, right? So that is very important, and that framework has to be developed at a regulatory level, so that every person knows, or every company who wants to make a product that involves many phytochemicals. And here I'd like to again emphasize what Bob said. I know only what I can measure in a phytochemical soup, right? There might be a lot of other unknown molecules in there. So we need to develop a system, standardized system, where whatever rigor we have applied to single ingredient drugs, we can also, with some confidence, apply to indigenous medicine in terms of the efficacy and toxicity information, right? Then let us come to the nutritional aspects. Uh, like Varun said, we don't have a single database, right? So when I look at the Indian food composition table as a biochemist and a person interested in nutrition, I'm looking at the nutrient compositions. I'm really not looking at the plant name at all, right? It's a secondary information for me. But the moment I start looking into deeply for rice, for example, right? So in the IFCT, there is just one rice. And we know that in India, we consume so many different rice varieties. So the moment I started doing it a little bit more in depth, I realized that this table is not sufficient for us. And whose responsibility is it then to tabulate the information of all the other biodiverse foods in the same category, right? Um, so we have to start from a place where all of these regulators are looking at the same information. We might not have the same depth of information for every single ingredient, right? But maybe we have to walk away from the fact that uh, one is only food and one is only medicine, because as we find in our own study, and Bob will tell us more about that, there is a overlap. So we feel that from a regulatory landscape, there has been too much of a silo that has been created, where every agency is only catering to its specific audience. Drug regulators are catering to doctors and looking at consumers. The nutrition is looking mostly from a nutritionist point of view, also as a consumer, but that same consumer is eating medicine and eating food. So we feel that there should be it, and this has to happen at government level and government to government level. This cannot be citizen led movements, where everybody has to start looking at plants at a single sort of a database level, and then they can expand it as required for their domains.
Sure, thanks, Megha. Bob?
There's so much to say. I think the first is that with this Indian data set that we pulled together for this particular purpose, or our colleagues in TDU largely pulled together, we were looking at 7,500 plants. So that's quite a diverse set of plants. It's not all of them, but it's a large percentage of the plants that are being used in India. And of those, we found 68% being used primarily as medicines, 32% primarily as foods, and 24% being used both as medicines and foods, probably in different dosages, probably different preparations, but nevertheless the same plant is being used. So that was a sort of a measure of the degree of overlap between what is a food and is a medicine, and the overlap in responsibilities between the regulators and their need to communicate with one another. A secondary point, I think, as I said, is that I quite understand why it is that an official working in the Ministry of Food might not know about how to use scientific plant nomenclature appropriately, but nevertheless, it is tragic that their data set actually has got names in there which are not unambiguous and precise. So you do not know what all that food composition data at which plant that actually relates to. So there are problems within individual regulatory data sets, but particularly as Megha said, they will be using different scientific names. And I think culturally this is very interesting. You talked about the silos, Megha, and I think we recognize that in Brazil and China and India there are different cultural traditions and different ways of viewing the world. But I think we underplay just how important those differences of approach go from one discipline to another. I know when I was working in northeastern Brazil, everyone thought there would be a really big British scientists and the Brazilian scientists talking with one another. It was not a problem at all. The scientists in the UK and Brazil understood one another fantastically. The development people in the UK and Brazil understood one another perfectly. But you try and get scientists to talk with development officials and in a language that they understand one another, and it's extremely difficult. It was a big challenge. I had a colleague that bought me the "Mind the Gap" T-shirt, and the gap he was referring to was the gulf between scientists on one hand and development people. And I think that those that have worked in nutrition and those that have worked in pharmacy are using scientific names that they're familiar with, that are embedded in their literature, and they are not lifting their eyes and thinking about what else is known about these plants. And Megha referred to the plant amla that had 2 different scientific names. In some cases, these medicinal plants have got 11, 12 different scientific names. And so one of the purposes of the medicinal plant names database that we have is that our users can come, resolve the ambiguity, and once they know which plant they're interested in, then they can again go and search PubMed and similar sorts of resources using all of the scientific names simultaneously. If you hit PubMed with a single scientific name for a medicinal plant, you retrieve only about 20% of the information that's actually published in PubMed. So you just lack most of the information because publications exist using alternative scientific names for the same plant. So you need to be aware of that, just as Megha was saying. And that, I think, is something that we are in a position to help and drive. And so the challenge is awareness of the problem, but also we have provided in this data set the full synonymy and would be able to push that in. And I think, if I may, there's just one other aspect of this, which is, I think, particularly interesting in the area of traditional medicine, is protecting the IP in this knowledge of how these plants have been used for centuries. And I know that the Indian government would be very keen to prevent companies establishing patents for plants, but external companies publishing patents for plants that have been used traditionally in India for a very long time. And so there is a traditional knowledge digital library which they have built. And its ambition is to protect the IP inherent in traditional knowledge in India. And that is as it should be and is laudable. We should support it. However, it does not hold synonymy in the database. And so I could walk into the patents office in London and try and establish a patent for an Indianly traditionally used plant, simply using one of the other synonyms. And the patents office will not know any difference, and they will grant me that patent. And so this information needs to be used and recognized across government within India, but absolutely, if you're trying to share knowledge between Brazil and India or between China and Afghanistan, you need this. The point of scientific nomenclature is that it should help us overcome this problem of cultural and geographical diversity.
Great. I guess, we can save so much of cost on, say, duplication of efforts, on making sure that the IP rests correctly with the appropriate original users and cannot just be copied. I think there's probably a lot of benefits for why the government should actually be recognizing singular names for apparently. Varun, would you like to add?
Sure. TDU is very unique. In a sense, it's an institution where you see traditional medicine and modern science that are juxtaposed, right? And we work together. I think we have a great opportunity and, of course, a duty to bridge the gap both in science, in terms of research, and in data. So we have an effort going on to build a citizens portal where our goal is to bridge that gap of data, bringing to citizens a comprehensive portal that I was talking about, earlier, which has information from classical texts. In the case of Ayurveda, it is Ayurveda classical text. It could be Unani and it could be Siddha as well. And the modern scientific information that's available from the scientific literature. Ultimately, we want to provide some data of evidence that will come from our hospital as well. So that's our goal, and I believe it's our duty to go back and do it.
Great, thank you. I have done so much from this podcast. I have been a great fan of Shakespeare, and I would have thought, rose by any name is still a rose, but clearly it isn't. And definitely a rose, calling something else a rose might, you might actually end up eating a poison. So it's better that we stick to some standardized form of nomenclature. I would like to thank all of my guests today. I think this was a very exciting, a very different kind of ATP podcast for us today. Thank you for being on the show, and I look forward to seeing more of your collaborative research and hoping for some real policy change come out of it.
Thank you for having us. I think it.
Very much.
Speak for all three of us. This was a very small effort, driven entirely by motivation that from Bob and Varun's work that was happening here between them, and then I brought in the nutritional angle. And you would not be hearing about something like this and how critical this is. And so we would like to thank you for giving us this voice and sharing what a big issue this is that nobody talks about.
No, thank you for bringing this up. Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.